1, 2, 3. Clap. Awesome.
Perfect. This is the first time it has worked, actually.
Yeah, only took us 13 episodes.
You're listening to Freelancers.
My name's Adele.
And I'm Mike.
We are two creatives documenting the process from being an employee
to becoming independent in real time.
Welcome to Freelancers, episode 13. Hi, Adele.
Hi.
And today we have, I'd say, my favorite Australian on the show, Mr. Peter C. Hayward. Peter is a big podcaster, and I've come across him through one of my favorite podcasts of all time, Being Honest with My Ex. He has also been recording for 2 other shows, and few of his other projects include writing erotica and managing board game companies. Hey, Peter, how you doing?
Hey, I'm good. How are you going today?
Pretty good.
Very good.
So you're recording from Canada?
Yes, I'm here in sunny Toronto, and I mean that completely not sunny.
Oh yeah. So has the winter landed already?
Yeah, it's been snowing and icing and very, very cold. So I've been walking outside as little as possible, basically.
Isn't it one of the first times in your life seeing snow on a regular basis? Or did you have snow in Australia?
It snows like at the top of mountains in Australia. When I was a kid, we went to one of those mountains and climbed to the top, and I tobogganed. But other than that, snow was definitely not a daily occurrence in my Australian life.
So what are the things that you like about Canada now that you live there?
So Canada is Canada's interesting. I said once on the other podcast that Canada takes all the best parts of Australia and combines them with the worst parts of America. And we got a very, very angry letter from someone being like, you don't even know what Canada's like. You've never been here. And then when she realized I lived literally 2 blocks from her, she was a little bit embarrassed. And we ended up becoming very close friends. So one of my closest friends in Canada sort of got in contact to get mad at me for bagging Canada. So I really like the people. They're very Canadian, which is a compliment. I find the weather interesting. I like that I live in an apartment that I don't have to like shovel the snow, because I suspect at that point I would enjoy the snow a lot less. But the snow is definitely interesting. It's a novelty. It's fun to go outside and see, white stuff falling from the sky, and you can make snowballs and all the cool things that as a kid they were all like movie things. I also like how many movies and TVs are shot here. I don't know if you two have ever seen Orphan Black or The Handmaid's Tale or Suits.
I'm a big fan of all 3 of them.
All 3 of those are filmed on my street. I will walk outside sometimes and I'm like, oh, look, it's this show.
Wow.
Yeah. So whenever we're watching those 3, I'm always like, oh, can I see my house? Can I see, what local attractions can I see? So there's always a bunch of stuff happening, which I like. I live right downtown in Toronto at a place called Cabbagetown, which is another thing I love about Canada. There is a suburb called Cabbagetown, and that's where I live.
Yeah. Although I heard that Toronto rarely plays itself in movies.
Yeah, no, none of those. Actually, no, that's not true. In Handmaid's Tale, the bits shot in Toronto are actually set in Toronto because they're trying to escape the US. So that is a rare exception. But I don't even know where Orphan Black's set. But Suits is definitely not set in Toronto, and yet it is largely filmed here.
Right. Well, I have a soft spot for Australia. I've been trying to get there for like 4 years, and I applied for a visa once.
Have you visited?
Not yet. So my first visa attempt was declined.
Yeah.
They thought I'm going to stay there illegally for some reason.
Which you were going to do, right? Like, you love the country. Your application form was, please let me in. I promise to never leave. And they were like,
Well, I wanted to get the study visa in order to experience it. And like, obviously, I wasn't going there to study. But at the same time, I wasn't really planning on staying there illegally. But now, guess what? I finally got the visa for real.
Hey.
So I got a work permit, and I'm going to go to Australia next summer, like the upcoming summer.
Whereabouts are you going?
To Melbourne, actually.
Oh, right.
That's my number 1 pick.
That is where my my ex-co-host, SJ, and ex-co-host has a double meaning now because we no longer co-host a show, and she's my ex. That's where she and most of my friends are based. So yeah, let me know when you're going over, and I'll hook you up with some cool people to hang out with.
Oh, thanks. So you're not from Melbourne?
I'm from everywhere. So I've lived in Toowoomba, Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, and Melbourne.
Wow.
Wow.
And Melbourne was the last place that I lived, but Sydney was the place I was born, and that's where I was the longest. And then Toowoomba's where I kind of grew up and did high school. And then Brisbane's where I became an adult. And Canberra's where I first broke out and made friends who I wasn't related to. And then Melbourne is where I met my ex-fiancée SJ and a lot of my friends. And so I've lived everywhere and I kind of grew up everywhere. I always think of it as I finished Australia. You know, I defeated the end boss and was done. So I moved on to the next level.
That's pretty awesome. So you can basically go anywhere in Australia and you know people.
Oh, yeah. I have a bed to stay in anywhere in Australia that's not Adelaide, Darwin, or Perth.
Wow.
That's awesome.
So are there things that you miss about Australia? Like something that still doesn't go away and you still think about?
Yeah, it's a lot of little conveniences. So Canada is obviously right next to the US, and they very aggressively define themselves as we are not the US. Like that's their main thing that they think about and that they identify themselves as. And so when I point out a lot of the kind of bad habits they have from the US, they're like, no, that's just how everyone does it. But it's not how everyone does it. For example, it's not how Australia does it. So for me, the two big ones are tipping. We don't have a tipping culture at all in Australia.
Really?
Yeah, you don't tip. It's not a done thing.
Okay.
And in Australia, the taxes are always included in the price. So whenever you see a number, that number is the amount that you will
the final number, yeah.
Yes, that's it. There's no more math that you have to do. Whereas here, if I'm at a restaurant and I see a burger for $12, that's not going to cost me $12. That's $12 plus tax plus tip. And so $12 is really just the minimum amount that I'm going to pay for it. It's not a realistic. I can't pull $12 out and be done. It's a whole bunch more steps. So that's the real main thing about Australia that I miss, the transparency of how much things cost.
Yeah, exactly. I learned this in the States when I went there. For 4 summers in a row, I was working as a lifeguard. And the funny thing is that Americans, they always kind of defend this approach. They say like, oh, tipping is necessary because the waitresses wouldn't have anything to live from, right? But I mean, if you pay them a regular wage, wouldn't it be better? And then they say like, yeah, but then the food would be more expensive. But I'm thinking you're already paying them extra. That's what the tip is for, right?
Yeah. It's only cheaper if you're not tipping. And if you're not tipping, it's not a great system.
Agreed.
And then there's the food and the people. Like they have Tim Tams over here, but what they don't realize is that in Australia we have probably 40 different types of Tim Tams you can get. There's every flavor you can imagine Tim Tams.
What's a Tim Tam?
Oh, Tim Tam is a chocolate biscuit, a cookie. It's like a like a normal kind of biscuit coated in chocolate, but there's 2 of them put together with a layer of mousse or icing in between, and it's the Australian biscuit. It's like the equivalent of a chocolate. It's the equivalent of an Oreo. It's like the Australian Oreo.
Okay.
And if you haven't had a Tim Tam, you've not lived. Go and find one. They're popular enough now that you can find them in most countries. So if you go to like the weird specialty section of your supermarket, you can probably find a Tim Tam. And the correct way to Tim Tam is you bite off each corner, and then you use it as a straw to like slurp up hot tea. And then when you bite the actual Tim Tam itself, it's like warm and mushy, like a mousse or a cake. It's incredible. And
I'm surprised Mike doesn't know what it is.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought you were an Australiophile.
Yeah. I mean, are there any other candies that I need to try?
Tim Tams are really the big one, but there's Cherry Ripes, which is a coconut cherry. It's like a coconut cherry thing dipped in chocolate, and those are very nice. There's Pavlova, which is a type of cake.
I know that one.
Ah, you know Pavlova. Okay, so that's a very Australian dish. The main thing Australian really does is, in the way that you would have hot dogs in America, we have meat pies. So little meat pies about the size of a teacup, and they're pastry and they're filled with a hot beef mince and sauce, and those are everywhere. Like every gas station, every petrol station, every 7-Eleven, you can get a fresh hot pie.
We've had those in Prague in my office every Friday.
Aren't they great?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, so those are like, there's literally entire chains in Australia of fast food places that just do meat pies. That's how big a thing it is over there.
Seems like I'm missing out on a lot of things. Well, I've already had the opportunity to try Vegemite.
Oh yeah, Vegemite. The trouble with Vegemite is that people put it on like peanut butter, whereas you have to have a lot of butter and a very thin spread of Vegemite, and That's peak Vegemite for you.
I mean, do you like it?
I love it. Yes.
I guess I might grow into it, but my first impression wasn't good.
You have to have it with a lot of butter and a little bit of Vegemite on some white toast. It'll change your life.
Okay, I'll let you know.
You can't just eat it by the spoonful. It doesn't work like that.
All right. Well, we touched on your ex-co-host, SJ, and your podcast, Being Honest with My Ex. So it's been almost exactly a year since your last update where you said you're on a hiatus until the next year. Any chances it's going to be the next year of 2019?
Hopefully. So, as you know, if you listen to that episode, I had a small baby. And having a small baby, turns out, is very, very time-consuming. To the point where it was hard to justify the getting back together and recording once a week and then spending the hours on editing. So one of the reasons we kind of stopped for a full year, as you've pointed out, is that I had a kid, and kids are very, very time consuming, and it's much harder to justify, 10 hours a week on something when you could be spending those 10 hours with a new human who you've created and is trying to grow into a full person. Another reason is just that the last few episodes were so there was an episode where we did a live show and I was completely out of line, and then when we next recorded, I had jumbled up the facts in my head and accused SJ of being out of line. And I was just completely wrong. Like, I was flat out wrong about it. And I attacked one of my best friends. And I was I don't know how much swearing allowed on this, but I was a real swear word about the whole thing.
Sure, go ahead.
I was a cunt. Like, I was an absolute cunt to SJ. And that wasn't fun for her, obviously. That wasn't fun for me. And we put that out there because the title of the show is Being Honest with My Ex. So I wanted to, put the honest interaction that we had, in which I was just terrible and she was just blatantly attacked despite doing nothing wrong. And once we'd put that out there, we got a lot of, people who were very upset. And so we kind of realized that we'd probably have to do another episode, just kind of breaking it down. And we'd always said that we wanted to do Being Honest with My Ex as long as it was fun. And I can tell you unequivocally at that point, it was not fun. It was not a fun thing to do. So really any excuse to not get back to it, we both kind of seized upon. And so the baby and SJ got another show picked up by the ABC, which did very well. And really, any reason not to do it, we seized upon and thus didn't do it. So we've been talking about kind of getting back into it. But if we do, it'll be with no schedule. It'll be when we feel like recording. It'll be the kind of fun, pleasant interaction we always wanted it to be, and not this deep, emotionally scarring, constant personal growth thing that it was, which is maybe what people liked about it. I don't know. But we do want to do it. We both really miss doing the show. We miss talking and hanging out more often. But we don't want to torture ourselves to make it happen.
I mean, I've listened to that episode where you accused SJ, but I didn't think it was in a malicious way. And I mean, you were pretty chill about it, at least in my head. Did she think it was malicious?
You're being very nice. No, it was never malicious. But, if you accidentally hit someone with your car, you haven't not hit them with a car, It was more that we have certain standards for the people that we hang out with and the people that we are. And I fell way below those standards for both of us, I'm pretty sure. And it was an unpleasant interaction that was then recorded for all time and put out on the internet. Mm. And I mean, one of the reasons I'd really like to start doing the show again is because I really, really did try to use that as an opportunity for growth and change the way that I behave and the way that I conduct myself, especially when I'm tired and upset. And I would like to not have the last kind of snapshot of my life be that.
Yeah.
But it's hard to make it a priority.
True.
I appreciate your defense. I don't think it's warranted.
All right. We'll let it up to SJ to decide.
Yeah, exactly.
So apart from the podcast, you've had some pretty interesting career progression. And do you want me to take a stab at the recap?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. So in my head, you started writing erotica. It was like your first gig. You did it part-time to full-time. Then you started the podcast with SJ, started one board game company, moved to Canada, started a family and another board game company. And then you still have a plan of writing sitcoms in the back of your mind.
That's pretty accurate. So let's go all the way back to when I met SJ. So I met SJ in 2010, I'm pretty sure. 2009, maybe? Yeah, I met SJ in 2009, almost exactly 10 years ago. And at the time that I met SJ, I was working in a call center for American Express. Very kind of standard job. I would answer the call and help people with transactions, etc. And on the side, just for fun more than anything, I was writing erotica and smut and porn and all kinds of naughty things. And as I was doing that, some people asked if they could have custom stories, and I charged them money. And I was like, oh, that's a nice little bit of pocket change. I did the math recently. I charged literally less than 10% of what I charge now. It's such a less than 5%, I think, even. I really charge quite a lot now. But I never thought, it was a couple $100 now and again. It was not enough to quit my job. And then I realized that I was not following my dream. So my dream is and has always been to write sitcoms. That's all I want to do in the world. And I wasn't doing it. So I quit my job at the call center and got a job on set in Australian TV straight away. I used all my contacts and I got a job. And I lasted 3 days, and it was the worst 3 days of my entire life. I was completely unhappy. I was leaving house at 5 a.m. and getting home at midnight and not sleeping and riding my moped and dealing with a awful coworker whose life goal was to make me quit. And she succeeded, and she thought that I got the job because I was a man and I didn't deserve it. And so she made my life a living hell, and it was work that I wasn't particularly good at. So maybe she was not wrong in thinking I didn't deserve to be there. And I just hated it so much. On the fourth day, instead of getting to set at 6 a.m., I accidentally slept in until 11. And at that point, I was like, I am done. I'm not going in. Not going to do it. But I'd quit my job and needed income. And so SJ actually found a Reddit thread of someone who made a full-time living writing erotica. And I thought, I write erotica. And it turned out that she made most of her money from selling her smut on Kindle. So where I'd just been doing commissions, she started a self-publishing system and was doing that. So I started putting my books on Kindle, and within about 3 months, I was making a full-time living. That was very exciting. So all of my income at that point was coming through erotica, and I was still occasionally doing commissions. About a year later, Amazon stopped allowing my kind of smut, and just suddenly my income disappeared overnight. But I had enough of a fan base that I was able to launch a Patreon, and I still have that Patreon, and that Patreon is now the majority of my reliable income. Even to this day, what's it, eight years later or whatever, 7 years later. So while I was doing this erotica, I realized I could do it a few days a month. I spent the rest of my time trying to put on some live shows, and they never really took off. And then SJ and I had a big explosive breakup, and I realized that I was putting all this time into live shows that were still not sitcoms. And I really wanted to make sitcoms. So after reading an amazing post called The Procrastination Matrix by waitbutwhy.com, and if you haven't read it, it is genuinely, I think, one of the best pieces of writing on the entire internet. It's changed my entire life. It's changed many people's lives. It's just really, really good at making you realize what you're not doing. After reading that, I realized that I wasn't writing sitcoms, and I wanted to go to the US where sitcoms are actually made, unlike Australia. I'm sorry to break your heart about Australia, but we don't really make much TV. And so I packed up and tried to move to the US. But it turns out it's very hard to get into Australia, it's very hard to get into the US. And I wasn't able to. And so I thought, you know what, I need an in. So I'd spent the last few months kind of noodling around with board games because it was not sitcoms. And apparently anything that wasn't sitcoms is what I was most passionately interested in. And so I started a board game company. And I started publishing board games with the intent being to build it up to such a point that I could use it as a way to get into the US, to get a US visa. And Toronto, I don't know if you know this, Toronto is one of the board game capitals of the world. Some of the most famous board game designers live here. There's a bunch of companies based here. And so I moved to Toronto and started a board game company and started a podcast with SJ because that was also not sitcom writing. And apparently that's the only thing I could do. And so I met Roxy, who I'm now married to, and we have a little baby called Henry, and basically did everything in the world that I could that wasn't sitcoms. However, the happy ending is that in the last few months, I've started actually taking sitcom writing classes, and I've had one of my shows put on as part of a class show, and I just yesterday finished a whole sitcom draft, and I'm actually writing sitcoms. And so the time that I was spending on podcasts and some of the time I was spending on board games, I've now reassigned to looking after a tiny human baby and writing sitcoms. So the plan is still to eventually write sitcoms. It just took me a very, very long time to get there.
And what is it about sitcoms that you like so much?
It's hard to say. I've always been fascinated by the structure of comedy. And that's a weird thing to say, but I'm really always interested in the way that jokes are broken down and stuff like the rule of 3 is that you repeat something 3 times. The first time sets it up, the second time establishes a pattern, and the third time subverts the pattern. And there's something in the human brain where we just find that inherently very funny. And so once you start looking for the rule of three, you will see it everywhere. And sitcom is a form of writing, which I've always done ever since I was a kid, where it's very rigidly structured. Like every sitcom episode, every sitcom premise has this real structure to it. And I just find that really fascinating. But I think more than anything, it's just that I like watching them. Like they are my medium of choice. I would rather watch a sitcom than almost anything else, movies, dramas, anything else. I'd rather watch a sitcom.
And what is your favorite sitcom?
My favorite right now is definitely Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which if you haven't seen, it's very good. It's just perfectly structured and all the characters are hilarious and it's got the right amount of heart and jokes and running jokes, and it's by a man called Michael Schur. So my previous favorite show was The Office, the US version of The Office, which I just adored. It really went downhill later seasons, but Michael Schur started as a writer for The Office, and if you know the show, Dwight's cousin Mose is actually played by Michael Schur. He left The Office to co-create Parks and Recreation, and then after Parks and Recreation, co-created Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And then while Brooklyn Nine-Nine's been running, he started a new show called The Good Place.
I've seen that one.
Isn't it great?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. This one man is responsible for such a large proportion of amazing current sitcoms, or amazing sitcoms of the last 10 years. And I think Brooklyn Nine-Nine and The Good Place are just the absolute peak of what he's done so far. So I'm really excited to see whatever show he comes up with next. Janet is my favorite character on that show. As well as that, I've always been a fan of British sitcoms. That's how I got into The Office, because I watched the British one. But there's a little British Welsh, English Welsh show called Gavin and Stacey, which it only went for 3 seasons, but it's just perfect. Like it's like 18 episodes. So the entire run is less than a single season of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but it is the most charming, delightful, lovely, lovable show. And if that was still running, that would definitely be my first. But they closed it with this little perfect storyline, and I absolutely love that show.
Okay, so just to clarify, what's your opinion on laugh track?
So laugh tracks are, I mean, people hate them. I don't. I have no issue with the 2 formats of sitcom, which is single cam, stuff like The Office or Parks and Rec or Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and multicam, which is, in quotes, filmed in front of a live audience. And back in the day, they used to actually be filmed in front of a live audience. And I think whenever possible, they try to. But if you're trying to do more complex stuff like How I Met Your Mother, I don't know if you've seen that one, but...
That one I actually have. As long as it was still viable for me, that the quality was good enough that I didn't mind the laugh track, that was fine. But this equation changed during season 4, and then I stopped.
Well, I think it was around season 4, maybe a little bit earlier, where they stopped filming in front of a live audience because they wanted to do so many complex things with like jumping back and forth. And the whole point of filming in front of a live audience is that, you know, they can follow the show like it's a play, and you can't do that when you have as many flashbacks and flash forwards and imagination sequences as How I Met Your Mother has. So they stopped filming in front of a live audience, but they kept the laugh track. And so that's the most common use of laugh track, when they want to film in front of a live audience, but they can't for logistical reasons.
What do you mean film in front of a live audience? There are actually people watching the set?
Yeah. So in How I Met Your Mother, the seat in the bar where they sit, we don't know what's on that wall because they never show it, because that's where the literal audience would sit. And so they would be watching it like it was a play. And so the laughter that you hear is the actual live laughter of people watching it in real time.
Everyone who has ever been to a shoot knows that it gets so tedious after 4 hours when you're reshooting every little scene 10 times. How can it be funny the 10th time?
Well, that's part of the challenge of that kind of show, is that they spend 2 days rehearsing so that they can get the entire half hour filmed in about an hour's time. They don't do retake. They'll try to do every scene anywhere between 2 and 5 times, but they'll have a bunch of lines prepared so that they can switch up the lines from take to take so that the audience is still surprised. So whatever line you laugh at, that might have been the 3rd time that they did a different line for that, or that might have been the original. And yeah, they'll try to get it done in about, let's say 60 to 120 minutes, in about an hour to 2 hours, so that it does remain fresh. And while they're taking down one set and putting up another one, the audience gets food and there's stand-up comedians there to entertain them. And I'm watching through Everybody Loves Raymond at the moment, which is a very famous sitcom from the 90s and 2000s. And that one is genuinely filmed in front of a live audience. There's no flashbacks, there's no cutaways. It's all scene. And they actually would film the scene in front of a live audience, move on to the next scene, film that one, move on to the next scene, film that one. And so all the laughs that you hear, or most of the laughs that you hear, are the actual audience laughing in real time at Ray Romano and the rest of the cast.
I mean,
Wow.
I wouldn't know if you're just joking.
No, this is serious. This is
This seems impossible.
this is the area in which I want to work. I'm very serious about comedy.
All right. Were you thinking about making sitcom podcast, or was it all just like sitcoms?
So at the moment, I'm simultaneously working on some shows to pitch to Canadian production companies and US production companies, and I want to start doing some little sitcom podcasts. So the ones that I'm trying to pitch are more stuff that's in the zeitgeist. So there's one about a trans father, because my husband Roxy's trans and he's a father. And there's one about an erotica writer, because I was an erotica writer. And so they're kind of based on real things and they're more grounded. And then the sitcom podcasts that I want to do are like sci-fi and fantasy and kind of otherworldly kind of stuff.
So that's one of the podcasts that is in the works that you're planning on releasing.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully. I'm trying to make sure I don't fill my time with so much stuff that I don't have time to be a parent or a husband or run a company.
Yeah. So when it comes to having a child, how difficult is it actually? And when you're freelancing while having a child, how is that like?
So having a kid, everyone tells you will sleep less and you'll have less time. And those things are just completely true. Yes, those are accurate statements. Roxy is breastfeeding Henry. That's the name of my son, Henry. And because he's being breastfed, it doesn't keep him full enough all night. So he wakes up during the night because he's hungry. He needs to feed several times during the night. And sometimes I'll actually sleep in a different bed just so I can actually occasionally get a full night's sleep. But Roxy never has that opportunity. Roxy has to sleep with the baby. And so I'll take him in the morning so that Roxy can get a few hours sleep while the sun is up. But yeah, the main thing that it impacts is just how much sleep you get and the quality of your sleep. And Henry's in daycare now, so he goes to daycare for most of the day. And I have to take him, which means I need to get up at 7:30. But if I'm also taking care of him at night and he just for whatever reason doesn't want to sleep, I might be up with him until 1 a.m. I will try to get to sleep. It'll take me a bit of time. I'll wake up in time to get him to daycare in the morning. When you have a little human who relies on you for everything, you can't just leave the house, you know? There's no like, oh, I'm just going to go out. Like, you two and most people listening at home, if you wanted to, right now, you could walk outside and go to a local park and read a book. Or you could go to the shops and buy some peanut butter. Or you could ride your bike around for a while. And without a lot of coordination, Roxy and I just cannot do that. For a long time, this kid needs to be watched every hour of the day because he's still learning how to be alive and how to be a human. And I work from home. And that means that like if there's a little baby crying, I find it quite hard to concentrate because, you know, I want to go and make sure he's okay and give him a cuddle. And so, yeah, the two big factors that have affected me is just time and sleep. And urgent has a different meaning when you're a parent because like, oh, this deadline's due? Okay, cool. But if I, you know, just put this kid in a drawer for 3 hours, he will die. I can't just do that. I need to, you know, everything kid-related is urgent and then everything else is secondary to that.
So how long do you reckon until you start getting outputs from the baby and it's not just about him not dying?
I'll tell you, he gives me output several times a day. It's not super useful, but he does produce quite a lot. I'm a little bit less worried about him dying now. Now I'm worried about him wrecking stuff. So I have a lot of board games and if I'm not paying attention and I'm looking after the baby, he will be rummaging through them looking for stuff that he can choke on.
Oh, wow. So is he like 2 now?
No, he's 11 months now.
Is he walking yet?
He has taken steps, but he doesn't realize that's a mode of transportation. It's like a party trick that he can do. So he will take steps, but he doesn't use that to get around. He'll like do some steps, be like, cool, I'm done. Now if I actually want to get somewhere, I'm going to crawl.
Okay.
It'd be like if you owned a car but didn't realize it could go from one place to another. You're just like, what a cool car. I'm glad I have that. Okay, now back to walking.
Can you work while you have him next to you?
So I just, and I mean literally in the last 48 hours, bought a little iPad Pro with an attached kind of keyboard. And that means that I can. But up until then, I've had like my computer desk that I'm sitting at now. And this room is the only room in the house that's not even remotely baby-proofed. It's full of... Looking around, I've got a paper cutter here, like it's just a big blade. I've got bits of board game just like on a bottom shelf. This room is completely non-baby proof. There's electrical cables just running around the place. That's another thing. When you have a kid, you need to look at everything from the point of like, if I was suicidal, could I kill myself on this right now? And if so, you can't have it within reach of the baby because there's a board game. I don't know if it was ever made. It was just a concept. It was very clever. It was a 2-player game. One player plays the parent trying to keep the baby alive, and they win if the baby's alive at the end of the 3rd round. And the other player is the baby, and they win if they die within 3 rounds.
Wow.
And that's absolutely what it's like. It's like he's aggressively trying to damage himself. And so while I'm looking after him, I can't be in this room because then he freaks out that I'm not around. And so I can't get any work done. But now I've got the iPad. The script I was saying I finished the other day, I did that on the iPad while looking after the baby, and I was very, very happy. It's been a significant quality of life improvement.
Mm-hmm.
So you can still write? And I suppose you're writing erotica most of the time?
Yeah, I write erotica 2 to 3 days a month. And when I do that, I really hand the baby off and lock myself in a room and just work for 12 hours straight.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reason I'm able to do it 3 days a month is if I'm just in the zone and doing absolutely nothing else, I have quite a lot of output. But if I have to stop and start, I can't really write erotica. So that one I can't write on the iPad. I mean, I can take the iPad to a coffee shop and just write for 10 hours there, but that one is not something I can juggle while holding a baby.
Has it ever happened to you that you closed yourself in and wanted to write, but you couldn't? You had a writer's block, or you weren't concentrated enough, or...
So I've been listening to a podcast called Cortex lately, which I've really been enjoying.
Oh, I love that one.
Isn't it
That's
great?
my favorite.
Yeah, that is my current favorite podcast. I just listened through the entire backlog in the last year. And this is why I got an iPad Pro. If you've listened to Cortex, you understand why I now own an iPad Pro and an Apple Watch. This is directly one-to-one for me listening to that show. And CGP Grey is one of the hosts, and he's a writer. And he describes it as a bounce rate, which I really like. So it's not so much writer's block. He calls it a bounce rate. When you sit down to work and you just can't, and you bounce. You just, no matter what you do, you can't hit the work. You keep bouncing off and having to do something else. And he says it's everyone has a bounce rate. No matter what your job, no matter what you're doing, there's days when you just get there and you just can't get started. Or maybe not everyone, but definitely creative professionals. There's days where you just can't get the work done. And so that's, I think, what we call writer's block. I like the term bounce rate more. My bounce rate is pretty low because I'm only doing it a few days a month. And if you only have to do something 2 or 3 days a month to make the majority of your income, you're pretty incentivized to do it. So about 5% of the time, I will spend a day just feeling like I'm hitting my head against the wall and just not getting anything done. And so I have a pretty low bounce rate, but it does happen. And when that happens, I just need to schedule another day in that month to write. Mm-hmm. Or more and more, I'm trying to get ahead. So I update my Patreon twice a month with 10,000 words for each update. So I write 20,000 words a month. But I found if I'm doing 3 days a month, I can do about 25 to 30,000 words. And so over time, my plan is to work a month or two ahead so that when something happens, when there's an emergency, when I have that bounce, I'm not falling behind.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I haven't really heard about erotica before I started hearing about it from you or your podcast.
Okay, you could admit to it. It's okay. We're all friends here. There's no shame.
Right?
I mean, how big is the market of written erotica? Because I could never imagine someone doing it full time.
So the tricky thing about porn, and I include what I make in that category, is that the market's huge in that most people in some form watch or read porn. The number of people who will pay for it is very low. So a lot of people listening to this will be like, oh, I watch porn all the time. Of course you can make a living off it. Yeah, but how often do you actually pay for porn? It's really rare that people pay for erotica, pay for porn. And then to flip it back the other way again, when people do pay, they pay a lot. So it's a really large market, a really small paying audience, and a really large amount of money that audience pays.
Mm-hmm.
So I have something like 100 or 200 Patreon followers, which, if you know much about Patreon, is very small. A lot of people will have in the thousands or the tens of thousands to make a living. No, maybe not tens of thousands, but definitely the hundreds, if not thousands, to have any chance of making a living. If people don't know, Patreon is a crowdfunding support website. It's a little bit like Kickstarter, but instead of being a one-off project, it's recurring month to month. Most people, when they have a Patreon, their minimum pledge level is $1 or $2. My minimum is $5. And to get the really good stuff, you have to pay $10. To get $5, you just get what I put online for free. Like, that's really just support the author and get it a bit early. If you want exclusive stuff, it's $10 a month. Sorry, not even a month. It's $10 for each update. So if I update twice a month, which I try to do, that's $20 a month. That's the equivalent of 20 patrons for a non-kind of erotic-based Patreon. And so, it's an interesting question. The market is large. The paying market is small. But when I sell a book on Amazon, I sell it for $3, even if it's only a few thousand words long. Whereas normally to charge $3 for something, it'd have to be 10 20,000 words long.
$3. Okay, because I've only seen books that started like 10, probably.
Yeah, but those are for full novels. Mine are short stories. And mine are short stories in that if you read it out loud, you would have read two of them if you're reading them at the same time as we were recording this podcast. Mine are short stories, like 3,000 to 5,000 words.
So essentially you're writing for your audience. I thought you had like custom requests from people.
Yeah, so I do take commissions. They take me a little while to get back to. So generally, because I'm writing 3 days a month or 2 days a month, I write whatever I'm in the mood to write. But for a very large amount of money, I will write whatever you want me to write. But I still have to be in the right mood to do that. So it'll take me a few months to get back to people. But when I do, they're generally very happy with it. So people will send me a fantasy that they have or some elements that they would like to see in an erotica story, and I will weave them into a story. As I mentioned earlier, I'm really obsessive about structure. So story structure is one of the things I've always been fascinated by. And so I take these elements or this fantasy that they have and I make it into an actual story with a protagonist and goals and structure. Mm-hmm. And people really enjoy that because they get all of their kinks and they get the heat, but it's in a story that, has a beginning, middle, end.
And how large portion of your audience is women?
So this is a good question. There's kind of a rule, which is that women don't pay for video, men pay for video, but men don't pay for writing. Women pay for writing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And on Amazon, that's certainly true. The vast majority of erotica purchases on Amazon are women. But my Patreon, because it's all based on the free sites. So I put all my stuff online on the free sites, which is mostly men reading it because men don't pay for written erotica. And then they see my Patreon, they think, I can get some exclusive stuff. So most of my Patreon supporters are men. Not all, but I'd say like 70 to 90%. And most of my Amazon purchasing audience are women. And again, I'd say like 60 to 90% there.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Because women function more by their imagination and men tend to be more visual. So it made sense to me to consider your readers women. But at the same time, I wouldn't think that women would go and find you on Patreon and...
Exactly, yeah. So women tend to buy their smut from erotica and men tend to get it online for free. And if you get it online for free, you'll see the link to my Patreon. And so just by nature of exposure to what I'm doing, men are more likely to be Patreon supporters. And men particularly, I don't think I've ever had a woman commission a story. The vast majority of my commissions are by men.
Really?
And I don't know if that's because they have, on average, higher disposable incomes and I charge through the roof, or if it's because, I don't even know why that is, but I've never thought about it before. Yeah, the majority of people who are commissioning stories are men. It
might be men buying it for the woman, no?
It might be. I based on the synopsises they send me, I don't think that's very common, but it absolutely could be. Okay. I don't know.
So Patreon, I suppose, is your main source of income right now?
Yeah, Patreon, I'd say, is a good 50% of my income, if not more.
And what makes the other half?
It's a combination of commissions. So I try to do a few thousand words of commissions each month. I don't always get to it, but when I do, it's nice to get that money. And then the rest of my income is from board games. So I run a small board game company called Jelly Bean Games, and I'm now on salary. As well as that, I get a percentage of games sold that I designed, which are my royalties.
And is it 2 board game companies or just one?
Just the one. We were seriously considering starting a second one, and we got all the branding. We actually made a game for the second one. Then we decided to instead focus on what we were finding success in. And so we ended up not starting a second board game company, although I do have a long list of designs that were ready for it if we ever had.
I was actually checking Kickstarter and I saw you released about 6 board games over there. Is that possible?
So since we started, which was in March 2016, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 board games on Kickstarter.
That's a lot. How do you come up with so many titles and ideas for them?
The issue is never coming up with the ideas. The issue is executing them right. So whatever I'm most engaged in is what I think about. So I started writing erotica because I was reading erotica. It's an art form that I very much enjoy. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh, here's what I would do. Here's an idea. Back when SJ and I were together, I got into playing board games. And as I was playing, I was like, oh, I have an idea of what you could do. And now that I work in board games, I spend a lot of time playing board games, which means I come up with a lot of ideas. So now I'm in the fortunate position of being able to sift through the ideas and only try to make the very best ones. And my list of board games to make is much, much longer than 9, I'll tell you that. And similarly, the more sitcoms I'm watching, the more ideas I have for writing sitcoms, which is why I really try to immerse myself in whatever I'm doing, because that's how my inspiration strikes.
And how long does it usually take to release one title, start to finish?
Start to finish. Okay, so I'll come up with a concept, and often I'll put that concept in my ideas drawer, and it just won't come out for months and months and months until it's had kind of time to stew or brew in my head. Once I start actively working on it, I'll have a first draft within maybe a week or two, like a playable version of the game that I can test and be like, okay, is there anything here, or is this an idea that was good on paper but just horribly disastrous when I try to actually play it? Once I've decided that it works and it's good, I try to get to what will be as close as I can to the final form, and that can take anywhere between 2 and 6 months, like just to keep on developing and iterating and working on it until I'm like, okay, this doesn't break and it's fun. Now, is it as much fun as it can be? And that can take a long time, or that can be a little time where I'm like, yep, I've tried all the things and this is absolutely as much fun as it can possibly be. So between idea and ready to start getting art is generally about a year, I would say. Mm-hmm. So like the idea that I started working on 2 months ago was something I came up with a few months before that, and I'm only 2 months in, and I know that I've got to make big sweeping changes before that'll be ready. Once we're ready to start getting art, we find an artist, we give them a brief, we get a few sample pieces of art, and they start work on it. And this one depends on the size of the game. So one game we've been working on for a full year, and we're maybe a third or a quarter of the way through the art because it's a big game that's going to need a lot of art. One game, we sent the stuff to the artist, and within 3 months, he was completely done. So that can take anywhere between 3 and 18 months, maybe even 2 years, depending on the size of the game. Then once we have enough art, we take it to Kickstarter. The Kickstarter takes about a month to run, another month to get the money. Once we have the money, we finalize everything, which takes between, say, 2 and 5 months. We hit print. It takes them 2 months to print, and then 2 months to put it on a boat. Or let's say a month. Let's say 6 weeks to get it on a boat over to us. We send it out to backers. That takes another month. And then once it's landed at backers, then we can start getting it ready for retail. And about 3 to 4 months later, it'll arrive in retail. So from the very, very first idea to when it actually gets to retail, you're looking at about 2 years minimum.
That's a long time. But it all sounds like it's a smooth ride. Like
yeah, nothing ever goes wrong. It's perfect.
Right.
No, we throw out a lot of ideas. It's the worst when we throw it out when we've gotten to the art stage, because by that point we've put some serious money into it. And then we're like, great, now we have all this really specific art for a game that won't get made.
Yeah, and I suppose you pay the artist in full.
Yeah, well, we have to. Yeah, we pay the artist for the art that they're doing, and then if we cancel, we don't pay them for future art unless they've started on it, in which case we pay for everything that they've done. But yeah, we desperately try not to cancel stuff when it gets to the art stage, but it has happened about 3 or 4 times now.
So you're not going to be one of those stories of when people pay for Kickstarter and not ever get the product?
Hopefully not. We are doing all that we can to make sure that's not the case. No, I think no matter what, people would get the Kickstarter. Like, even if I had to take out a loan, even if I had to, sell the rights to another company and they fulfill it in exchange for the game, we would always make sure that our Kickstarter backers got the game.
So would you think that you have Kickstarter figured out by now? Is it something that is still unpredictable, or?
It's very unpredictable. Yeah. Part of the reason that is the case is that Kickstarter is changing so much. So I don't know if either of you two follow board games, but board games is currently in its golden age. Like, this is the best time in history to be a board gamer. In 1996, there were maybe like 200, 300 games released. In 2018, there were 5,000. And there's so many games, people have so many options that it's really hard to break out from the pack. And it's a little bit like running a podcast. Like, if you started podcasting in 2003, you were one of the 10 podcasts out there. And if people wanted to listen to podcasts, they were going to listen to you. If you start a podcast now, you really have to work to stand out. Like, you can't just start a podcast and expect the audience to come. You have to have something that's unique, whether that's the premise, or whether that's the topic, or whether that's the dynamic between the hosts, or whatever it is. You really have to do something different. And board games are very much in that arena. And so this year we actually cancelled 2 Kickstarters. For the first time ever, we cancelled Kickstarter, and then we cancelled another one because we got a little bit complacent. We were like, hey, people like our games. People know that we make good games. So we'll just put it out there and people will buy it. And people were like, look, it's fine, but there's a lot of other stuff right now I could be putting my money towards. why would I choose you? And so in the example of Village Pillage, we launched that in, I believe, March and ended up cancelling it and relaunching in April. When we relaunched in April, we added little wooden turnips because it's a turnip-based economy game. And people really fell in love with these turnips, and that was our most successful Kickstarter of the year because we had these little wooden turnips. But the first launch, we were just like, it's a good game. And being a good game is simply not good enough these days. In the same way as being a good podcast, you can have a good podcast. Why listen to this over 100 other good podcasts?
Right. You're calling it the golden era, but at the same time, you're describing it as one of the most difficult times to get a board game out.
It's the golden era for consumers.
Not for...
All right.
Not for companies. No, for companies, it's a really tumultuous time, which is fine. Like that's just the nature of it. But it also means that if you hit, you can hit really big. If you have a successful board game today, you will sell literally 1,000 times more than you would from a really successful board game in 1999.
And how often do you play board games yourself?
I try to play as much as I can. So Roxy and I, my husband and I, play board games when we get the chance. It's one of those things that having a baby makes it really, you can't hold a baby and play a board game because all they want to do is touch what their parents is touching and then put it in their mouth. And for board games, I don't know if you know much about board games or babies, but that's a bad combination. I have a prototype night every 2 weeks at my house. So a bunch of friends come over with prototypes and we play through mine and theirs. Roxy and I try to play board games at least once a week. We don't always hit that. Sometimes we manage to play more. And now that Henry's in daycare, I try to really, during the day, get work done because I'm able to work without a baby to play with. But it's also a really good time to play board games because there's no baby around.
Right.
So I personally have 3 revenue sources when it comes to board games. Obviously, we have the Kickstarters. When we back a Kickstarter, we get money from that and we use that to make the game fulfill it. And sometimes we have enough left over to pay ourselves or keep the company running or invest in the next game. We are currently in retail. So if you go to most retail stores in the US, you can find our games these days, which is great for me because that's how I got into gaming, by going to stores and seeing what was there. As well as that, we're in Barnes & Noble, the big chain of bookstores. So Lady and the Tiger is one of our games. It's a really, really pretty game. And you can go into Barnes & Nobles all across the US and find that game there. And so as a company, our 2 main revenue sources are Kickstarter and retail. And we use the Kickstarter funds to print excess copies, which we then sell in retail. The difference being that we get the full price of the Kickstarter copies and a tiny proportion of the retail because it has to go through the whole chain. And then I personally do a lot of freelance development. So larger companies who have got a board game and they're like, look, this is not quite there. I use the same skills that I've built up over the time working on my own games and working on Jelly Bean games to freelance with them and help improve their games or come up with ideas or play test for them, all that kind of stuff.
Mike, do you play board games? Have we ever played board games together?
Well, Adele is really not a big fan of board games.
No.
She's kind of like SJ. I do like board games, but I don't get to play them very often.
It's funny you say that. The first game that we released through Jelly Bean Game was called Scuttle. And on her most recent podcast, No Feeling is Final, SJ talks about when she was having a really dark, depressive time. Her and her boyfriend Graham went away to just like a holiday home, essentially, like a friend's place out in the country. And they just played cards for like 2 weeks straight. And she didn't mention this on the show because it wasn't relevant, but the card game that she played for about 2 weeks straight was Scuttle. And so I got this message from SJ being like, Peter, Scuttle is fantastic. Like, I've played this. She's probably played Scuttle more than I have at this point, and that's really saying something.
That's awesome.
And so the games that we make through Jelly Bean Games are not for like hardcore gamers. So they're actually different to the games that I play. When I play a game, I want to sit down and play something for like 2 to 3 hours that makes my brain burn. Whereas the games that we play are games that are designed to be played with kids and by kids. And so ours are much lighter games, or adults as well. Like we hope that everyone likes them. We're trying to be the Pixar of board games, essentially. But yeah, SJ, avowed board game hater, very much enjoyed the first release that we made. And so yeah, if you're not into board games, check out Jelly Bean Games. It might surprise you.
So is there like a gateway drug into board games? I love Bang, for example. That's my favorite one.
Oh, yeah. So there's a whole category of board games that are referred to as gateway games, and Jelly Bean is very much in that category.
Now, back to podcasts. Do you want to uncover something about your upcoming one?
So, again, to reference Cortex, on Cortex, they talk a lot about side projects and this idea that for them particularly, they need something that's not their main focus to like blow off steam with. And they talk about the relative value of a side project. So if you have a full-time job working as a desk jockey, just doing admin or whatever, your side project might be starting a small business. And then if that business ever takes off, it will become your main project. But even then, they firmly maintain you still need a side project, something that is not high pressure in the way that your main thing is. So for me right now, erotica and board games are my two main things that I do, and they suck up all my energy. And Being Honest with My Ex has always been a side project. That's something that I do for fun, for me, for reasons that aren't necessarily money. And I recently, listening to that, I realized that what a hole in my life there was because I didn't have any side projects. So I've started, again, writing sitcoms, which is very much a side project for me right now. I'd like to make that my full-time thing, but I'm nowhere near that. And I realized that I spend a lot of time just with my family, either alone in this room or hanging out with my baby and my husband. And my only socialization is board game related. I will either go to a playtest night or I'll have people over prototypes. And I didn't really have any personal connections outside of that. And so my brother and sister and I have started a side project, and we don't know if it's going to go anywhere. It might never see the light of day, but it's an excuse to hang out with my brother and sister as often as possible. Mm-hmm. And it is it's a podcast with the three of us where we're answering trivia questions. And so each episode, one of us is the host and the other two are competing for points. And we're going to keep a tally over every episode we ever make. So we'll rotate hosts, and eventually there'll be a winner, I guess, if we ever stop. But there'll be points in the hundreds by the 15th episode.
Okay, I like the idea.
Yeah, I don't think we even have a name for it yet. It's just a little fun side project.
Are all of you in the same location?
No, I'm in Toronto, and my brother and sister are both in Brisbane. And they actually lived with each other up until a few months ago. And so as soon as they moved away from each other, we started this podcast. It would have been so much more convenient if they'd all been in the same place. But yeah, so just like I'm Skyping with you guys internationally, I Skype with them internationally, and one of us has a bunch of questions prepared. And yeah, we hope it works. I mean, that's the joy of a side project too. It doesn't have to hit KPIs. We don't have to get X downloads within the first X months. Mm-hmm. It's just a thing that we're doing for fun, and we're not going to have a timeline. We're not going to have a deadline. We're not going to have a schedule. We're just going to make it when we feel like making it, put it out there. And it's just a nice excuse for the three of us to bounce ideas off each other and have fun and laugh and learn things about the world.
That's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. That's how we feel about this podcast, actually.
Yeah, it's just I don't know what your relationship is, but it's just a nice way to connect with someone. I've found for me particularly, if I don't have a reason to interact with someone, they will kind of just drop off my radar. And it's not malicious, but since SJ and I stopped making Being Honest with My Ex, I've talked to her maybe 7 times in the last year. Whereas we used to be talking every day because we were getting ready for the podcast and editing the podcast. And if you're in that interaction with someone, you naturally talk about other things as well. And so, yeah, an excuse. If you're ever trying to make friends, my advice would be find an excuse to interact with them regularly. And that's why people like soccer clubs or trivia nights at the pub or having a baby together. As a reason that you really have to interact regularly, you'll find yourself building a bond no matter what. So many people marry people they work with because it is an excuse to see them every day. And over that time, you build up shared jokes and a connection and you bond. Yeah.
Yep.
Damn, that's a pretty wise thing to say. I've never heard anyone say that before.
It's something I think about a lot because I've moved so many times. I've lived in so many different places. I've had to make friends. And so, again, I like structure. I really kind of broke down what it is to make a friend and how it happens. And there's a movie called I Love You Man with Jason Segel and Paul Rudd. And I was blown away when I watched that because they'd taken the system I'd kind of mentally worked out and turned it into a film. But it's just a really nice little breakdown of how you make friends with someone.
That's an excellent point to finish on. So to wrap up, you want to tell us where can people find you?
So best way to find me is just Twitter, Peter C. Hayward. That's Peter C. Hayward. I have some other websites. They're all horribly out of date. But if you go to peterchayward.com/about, that is kind of a brief summary of what I'm about. Beard.blue theoretically has all my projects, but it really doesn't. And then jellybean.games is where you can find all of the games I've been talking about. If you want to check out my erotica, look for Pan. Pan is my pen name. I'm on Literotica. I'm on mcstories.com. I'm trying to put it myself up on other places, but those are the 2 main places where you can find my work.
Okay.
And if from reading this, you really want to give me money, patreon.com/panwhowrites. That's patreon.com/panwhowrites.
All right. Thanks, Peter. Thank you so much for making the time. It was a pleasure having you on. Hopefully, we uncovered some of the more interesting questions about you. And it was great, for me at least, to get an update on what your life is about right now.
Thanks so much for having me. I hope that was what you're looking for.
Definitely.
It's the sounds of our lives.
Check that your hand luggage is stowed correctly. Straighten your seatbelt, secure the table in front of you. Lower the armrest.
In January 2019, me and Mike, we flew to Cape Verde, or as he likes to call it.
Depends. I like to call it Cape Verde. Americans call it Cape Verde.
But the official Portuguese name and pronunciation is Cabo Verde. And I read an article where the Cabo Verdeans, well, the people that actually come from these islands, they are trying to make sure that people call it correctly, Cabo Verde.
So the way we got there was obviously by a plane. This time Adele was the one finding the flights, as usual anyway. And it was Brussels Airlines, right?
Yes, from Brussels to Boa Vista, which is one of the islands of Cabo Verde. And I found these tickets online back in October, I believe, 2018. And we got a really good deal. We paid around
$200? Yeah, about that.
We thought that it would be exciting to go to an island we've never been to.
Yeah, and I've never been to Africa either. So it was a 6-hour-long flight. It was difficult because there was no food.
Yeah, and the flight attendants were not the nicest I've ever met. Yeah.
I believe we didn't even get water.
We got nothing. First of all, I didn't think that Brussels Airlines was a low-cost airline, which it might be, but I just never thought of it that way. And second of all, I thought there was some kind of rule, and there might be, saying that if a flight is longer than some period of time, you have to be offered at least water, but I'm not sure.
This was the first flight that I've ever heard of or been a part of where you could take a layover without deboarding the plane. So they flew over to the island. They stopped in one airport on one island. And then the people that were continuing to the other island just stayed in their seats. And not even 20 minutes after we left the plane, they were already in the air flying to the other island.
The plane flies in a circuit between Brussels, Boa Vista, which is the first island where we were, and Sal, which is another island of the archipelago of Cabo Verde.
I think of 14 islands, right?
I'm not sure, but you might be right.
It is now 12:30 local time, so 2 hours earlier than in Brussels. Please remain seated. Keep your seatbelt fastened until we have...
After we got off the plane, I mean, even before we got off the plane, from the air, it looked like there is nothing really below, just sand, no vegetation, and a road here and there. I still maintained this feeling after we landed.
We landed at a super small airport. It was the smallest airport I've ever seen.
Yeah, me too. We basically just got a taxi and tried to get to our Airbnb.
We gave the taxi driver the name of the house or the name of the Airbnb where we were staying. And so because he didn't know where to go, I showed him the place on a map in the Airbnb application.
And the funny thing is, there are no addresses.
There's just the name of the city, which, I mean, there's one bigger-ish city that resembles a small village in the Czech Republic. With its size, not the way it looks like. And he drove us to the middle of nowhere. There were just a few buildings. There was no road. It was just all dirt. And that's where he dropped us off, right?
Yeah, and we didn't even see the city. It's like he just took us from one point at the desert to another.
Yes. And we got out, we searched around, we were thinking maybe it's somewhere around here, but clearly it wasn't. And then this happened.
Okay.
Yes, not far away.
We met a local worker minding his own business. We asked him for directions, and he wasn't even that surprised by us because apparently there's enough tourists on this island. And he just told us that he knows the place. He knows the Casa de Pescador. Is it called that?
Yes, Casa de Pescador. Mm-hmm.
And he took us through the whole city, basically, and walked us exactly to the place where we lived. It was quite amazing because it took us maybe 20 minutes to walk there. And he did it for us, which was very nice.
We found out he actually wasn't from Cabo Verde, but from another small state in Africa. And he moved here because he found a job here.
Yeah, I'm working in a hotel, a restaurant, barman in a restaurant.
And he told us a little bit about the island and walked us directly to Casa de Pescador.
Pescador, yes. That's it.
Is it?
I think so.
Sorry, I have to go. Sorry.
Obrigado, man.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Our host was an Italian woman called Francesca.
Ciao.
Piacere, Francesca.
Mica.
Piacere, ciao. Adela. Hola, tutti e tre. Arriva agora.
Francesca took us to a beautiful, beautiful apartment located directly in the port, overlooking the ocean and the local fishermen. It was very beautifully decorated in a pirate style, so it was a true Casa de Pescador, or pirate's house, as she calls it on Airbnb.
Because water and electricity is apart.
Okay.
When it's finished the holiday, you pay. Because it's Africa and the water is more expensive. Yes.
Right.
And you think...
The details were breathtaking. In our room with the bed, in our bedroom, we had a wardrobe that was made out of an old boat, I believe.
Yes.
And there were little details that reminded you of boats and fishermen and the life that you live on this island. And what are the odds? But all the tourists living on the island, they probably lived in a hotel nearby. And somehow, every day, they ended up showing under our window, buying souvenirs from local women. It was funny for us because we went to Cape Verde not to have like a generic vacation, but instead to live more locally. And this was like the best reminder of that.
Yes, we definitely did not experience the typical resort-like hotel type of vacation in Cabo Verde, which is very typical for this part of the world.
Yes.
I found this apartment on Airbnb and I will link it in the show notes.
Considering this was really close to the equator, it wasn't that hot. So every day the temperature got to around 20 to 25 degrees, which is in mid-70s for you Americans. And the bad thing was that it was quite windy and sometimes it felt even colder. So it was almost calling for long sleeves and trousers.
Yeah, since the wind was blowing from the ocean, it was super, super cold.
Yeah, but it wasn't that bad. Like overall, it was much warmer than it would be in Europe.
And sunnier. The sun was amazing.
Yeah, the sun was great. And so we had two activities planned for ourselves. One was a fisherman trip. So our friend would take us to open sea and we would catch our own fish and then eat it on a smaller island nearby, making our own fire. And it would be like a really nice local genuine trip. And then yeah.
And you're missing the best part. The best part was snorkeling.
Oh, snorkeling.
And Mike wasn't even excited about that. I was super excited about snorkeling. And I really did not care about catching my own fish since you might probably know I'm a vegetarian, so I don't even eat fish. But the snorkeling was what I really was looking forward to.
As you might not know, I'm not a big fan of water. Despite working as a lifeguard for 3 summers in a row, I was much more excited about the fish. But despite the excitement that we built up for this trip, this happened.
He canceled on us, so while we were planning it and we were supposed to meet at 9 a.m.
He called us at 9 a.m. and said that he's on a different island and that he can't go.
Now we're faced with the prospect of having nothing much to do because we haven't planned for anything else, right?
Yeah, and it's not really beach weather, it's pretty cold.
Yeah.
So we're sitting at a bar, it's 9 a.m. Mike is having a drink, as usual. On the other hand, the second big activity that we wanted to do while on this island was quad biking, and that did work out, and it was amazing.
Yeah, that was excellent. That was the highlight of this trip for me.
Okay, so we're riding the the quad bike. It's a lot of fun because it can go quite fast.
Especially on those bad roads.
Yes, the roads are quite terrible because...
I mean, there are no roads.
well, they tried. They're like...
We made a trip throughout the whole island. We visited some of the beautiful spots like the beaches in the southern part of the island. We saw a shipwreck of a Spanish ship that
washed ashore.
For me, the most beautiful part was the Viana Desert.
Mm-hmm.
We actually got stuck in the desert on our quad bike quite a few times. Stop! Stój! We drove down the dunes and it was pretty scary. Luckily, we both survived this ride and we highly recommend it to everyone who goes to this island.
Other than that, we just relaxed.
Did a little bit of work.
Went to local pubs.
Hola.
Played with children.
I spoke Spanish.
Sí. Ok, ¿está bien? No? Ok, gracias. Obrigado.
I tried to speak Portuguese.
Oh, and so we don't forget the most important activity.
We also played Peter C. Hayward's, yes, the guest of today's episode,
His game called Scuttle. That's the first one he ever released, and he calls it the gateway game.
Takže tohle nemá number.
Ale to je Joker, tam si můžeš dosadit jakýkoliv.
Ale není tam number.
Kdyby byl Joker tady, tak si můžeš sem dosadit jakoukoliv action.
Myslím, že jde.
Já si myslím, že jo.
What would be more fitting for playing a pirate-themed card game than playing it in a pirate house on a tropical island in the middle of the Atlantic?
And the last thing to mention here is that I actually shot a video of our trip. So if you're interested in what Cape Verde looks like, or maybe you want to visit the island, I featured a lot of drone shots in it, so you'll get a nice overview of what to expect. And I put the link in the description, so if you have 3 minutes to spare, go ahead and watch it. Visually, it's probably the most pleasing looking video that I've ever made. I hope you'll like it. There's one more thing we wanted to tell you, Peter.
Talk to you next time.